Hey, 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 all you lovely people out there. I know you've got a lot going on in your day and you have big dreams for your brand. Are you ready to talk some shizzle and learn some shizzle from entrepreneurs, leaders, change makers, and overall interesting people who like to shake things up? I'm your host, Taylor Wilson, founder of Creative Shizzle, and I'm stoked to bring you a fresh episode of Talking Shizzle today. This show is all about helping you think differently so that you can grow your business or your cause. Check us out on the web at creativeshizzle.com. Now let's get into it and talk some shizzle. All right, what's up, everyone? We are back with a brand new season of Talking Shizzle. It's been a little bit of time since we've gotten on the podcast and behind the mic, and I'm super pumped to have Julia Campbell, a really good friend, here today to talk about using podcasts to grow community and build your brand and have interesting conversations. How are you?
I am doing fantastic, and I'm so excited to be on your podcast as you're kicking it back off again.
I know. It's exciting. I got kind of tired. I don't know. I was thinking I got a little bit burnt out of talking for a bit, and I needed a pause. You've probably felt that as a podcast host. I was hosting podcasts for many years in a row and just kind of was like, I need a break. And now I feel refreshed, ready to come back and do it again. Okay, so Julia, you know what's funny? I was thinking about this. I think we've been working together on your podcast for almost 3 years.
I think it's been 3 years this August. I can't believe that. I know I need to probably do some kind of celebration around it, but that's crazy.
So tell us a little bit about why you decided to do a podcast in the first place.
I love speaking and I love writing. I love creating content and talking to nonprofits. I love networking. And my background is in journalism. So I studied magazine journalism at BU. And I thought I was always going to be traveling the world and be either a print journalist or like a TV journalist. Like the morning show was my favorite show. I just love, Murphy Brown, all of those. I love the idea of storytelling and talking to interesting people about interesting things. So for me, when I started the podcast, it really was a form of content creation, like giving something for free, putting something out there to nonprofits that really struggle and need help. And it was a lot about marketing and sort of building up my visibility and sort of getting my voice out there. And now it's a little bit more about networking and meeting interesting people and people that I would want to meet that I wouldn't really have a good excuse to just sort of email them. But I could say, oh, I read your LinkedIn post. I read your Forbes article. I read your Harvard Business Review article. I think you'd be a fantastic guest on my podcast. And then since I have been doing it for a while, I do have some credibility and some receipts around downloads and listenership and things like that. So now for me, it's a great way to sort of also stay abreast of what's going on in the industry, but connect with people that I probably wouldn't have just randomly kind of reached out to and said like, hey, can we have a 15-minute coffee? So for me, it's really been great in building my professional network as well.
Do you find very many people ask you, well, what's your audience size or anything like that before they agree to come on your show?
No, I have literally never had anyone ask that. I think the reason is I usually am introduced to them by someone else or have met them personally, maybe at a conference, or I do a lot of research. So I wanted to have Jenny Blake, who's one of my favorite authors. She wrote Free Time. She has a podcast called Free Time. She actually wrote the book Pivot. And I'm still obsessed with her. I'm the biggest fangirl of Jenny Blake. So I wrote her this really thoughtful email and I said, look, I've read all of your books. I listened to your podcast. I really think that these 3 themes would resonate really well with my audience. They're nonprofit marketers and fundraisers. And she immediately said yes. And then once I had her, then I reached out. I could say, oh, I reached out to another author I love, Tamsin Webster. I said, oh, I've had Jenny Blake on my podcast. Would you come on? And then once I had both of them, I reached out to another author I love. So it's kind of snowballing, but I think doing your research, I get so many pitches for people to be on my podcast that clearly have never listened to my podcast and don't understand what it's about and don't understand the audience. And if it's something like that, I usually don't respond. But oftentimes, I find that people are just not doing their research. They're sending out blanket pitches, they're sending out blanket statements. And I find that when you're interacting with someone and you're asking them for their time, take some time to do some research. So whether it's me approaching a guest or whether it's a potential guest approaching me, it is always sort of very personal, and I really do my due diligence.
I cannot back that up enough. And I agree. We haven't even been podcasting for a while myself. I still have a lot of random people email me about or LinkedIn me about being on a podcast that I haven't even touched in 3 years. I'm like, I'm not even doing that show anymore, and then it's just off base. So yeah, I agree. I think definitely, I love your point about like using it as a networking tool. I totally 100% think that it's a really good tool to be able to give something back to someone when you're reaching out to them instead of just asking for the 15-minute coffee break.
Right. There's people that I've wanted to meet professionally, and I have met them through the podcast. And then I do feel like I could reach out and say, oh, I saw you spoke at this conference. Would you be willing to introduce me to the organizers? Or, oh, I saw that you self-published a book, like Miko Whitlock I just had on the podcast. I've been talking to him about self-publishing. And to me, it's a great doorway. It's almost like an entryway into building a relationship that's even stronger with people. Because, I don't feel very comfortable just sort of jumping off and saying, oh, I saw you did this, or I saw, you're connected with this person. Can you connect me? It's more, what can I do for you? And then earning that right to sort of ask them for a favor.
Okay. So you've been podcasting almost 3 years. You run a business. You're on the road a lot. How do you get it done? As we're talking to other busy entrepreneurs or people maybe who are thinking about a podcast, or maybe even people who do a podcast and don't feel like they're managing it very well. Like, what are some things that you've figured out to keep a regular show going while not feeling burnt out about it?
I have a very regular structure for how I do my podcast now. So I use Calendly to schedule, and I only record, I believe, the middle 2 weeks of the month, usually Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, only between like 10 a.m. and 3 p.m. So I, first of all, very much set the parameters of when I'm going to podcast. I like to batch. I don't like to be like a podcast recording here, a podcast recording there. I like to batch my episodes, and I like to know that I have a podcast day and just know like I'm focused on that. And the other thing I do is I have the podcast prep form that I took from somebody else that, you know what I mean? Like, it's all, I'm happy to send anyone my podcast prep form, but I took it from someone else whose podcast I had been on and then adapted it. And for me, that really helps the guest understand the questions, the headshot, the bio. There's sort of a checklist you have to go through. So making sure that, sort of all the I's are dotted and the T's are checked. But Taylor, working with your company, that has just been so amazing, because I know once it's recorded in Riverside, I really don't have to touch it again. Like, your team takes it, you do all the things. It's sort of like, if you plan well ahead of time, then it becomes a well-oiled machine over time. And I feel like, having done it now, it's so hard to believe it's been 3 years, but knowing that every Wednesday a podcast is going to go out, like, no matter what, and trying to really, do the episodes when I have some high energy and when I'm like, it's not a busy time period for me. But my advice to, podcasters would be, it really is about consistency, and it's about what you're comfortable with doing. But I think batching like, if you have 4 podcast episodes that you can do in 1 day or 2 days, and then, a whole month is ready to go and ready to be edited and ready to be sent out in the world, it's just kind of such a weight off your shoulders. I also have sponsors, and that management, the sponsors are lovely, but that management takes a lot, because there's always saying the recording of the pre-roll, keeping them updated, the final report, making sure that I'm promoting them throughout the month. So that's probably the most amount of work. With the guests, they're usually just very well prepared. They know what they want to talk about. I send them some questions ahead of time. And then, as long as their sound is good, we're kind of off to the races.
Okay, so how did you start getting sponsorships? Because I don't think you started your show with sponsorships, and that's common.
It's only been the last year, maybe.
Yeah, and you always have a sponsor now. Speaking of someone who sees the back end of the show.
Right, exactly. Because I always have a pre-roll, and then usually I do an episode with the sponsor. Or what I want to start doing now is like a LinkedIn Live with the sponsor, and then turn that into sort of a bonus podcast episode, which is value add for them. So I started my podcast after I'd really already built an audience. I'd had my blog for years. I'd been speaking. I had 2 books. I had, my online courses, and I'd been doing free webinars forever for all sorts of software companies. I really wasn't starting from scratch. So I can't speak to getting sponsorships starting from scratch, because they do want to know that you have an audience. I find that my sponsors are not as concerned with download numbers as they are with my reach in terms of like my email list, my social media, and just having them be able to promote whatever it is they want. Like certainly we measure, are they getting for instance, if they're promoting a report, are they getting certain amount of clicks and downloads on the report? Or if we're promoting a webinar together, what's the registration and what's the turnout? But I think you have to really establish that you have something to add to the conversation. And then the sponsors are going to, sort of get something out of it. And keeping in touch with them, I think what happens is we reach out to sponsors, they give us a check, and then they never hear from us again. Like I try to stay in touch with them, and then I ask them about next year, what are your plans? Do you have your marketing budget for next year? What are you thinking? Like, what else can I do for you? How else can I add to this? But I hesitated for so long. And then someone asked me, I think it was one of the companies came out and just asked if they could sponsor. And I completely made it up out of nowhere on my first podcast sponsorship pitch deck. I'm also happy to send to anybody that wants it, and completely made it up, and they accepted it. And I thought, okay, here we go. And then once I had that sponsor, then I felt like I could go to other sponsors. But just starting small, for me, it's not going to be something that's going to pay my mortgage, but it's going to pay for podcast production, and it's going to pay a little extra as well. So for me, it's definitely worth keeping it up. But yeah, we'll see how it goes. Some podcasts I know do a year. Some podcasts do 6 months. I do monthly, but sometimes the sponsor will buy multiple months.
I think it's cool that you change it up every month. I mean, also it gives your audience like a different jingle to hear. They're not always hearing the same, sponsor role. As someone who listens to podcasts, sometimes when I hear the same like commercial over and over again on the podcast that I like, it gets a little, like you just kind of tune it out, and so I actually think it's cool and a good idea that you do yours monthly. Do you prepare or give your sponsors like a monthly report out on like downloads or reach or anything like that? So is that something that like that's part of your communication to help them kind of continue to see the value?
Yes. So I give them usually the first week into the next month. So if it's a May sponsor, the end of the first week of June, you would get a list of all the episodes, who were the guests, the download number as of June, whatever it was. Because the thing is, the downloads are always going to increase. I need to actually probably get better about following up 6 months later and sending them a new download number, because, for me, it's increasing over time. People find it, they listen to one, and then they're like listening to another one. And then I share with them the email marketing that I did, the social media marketing, the reach, and I look to them to tell me, if they feel like they accomplished what they wanted to accomplish. Like I can't tell on my end how many downloads or how many website hits they got. But if they want to share that, I add that into the report so they kind of have it all together. And then next steps for working together, I always give my current sponsors the sort of first right of refusal for the next year. My only issue now, and this, Taylor, is all the software companies I work with are like merging and buying each other out. And like everything's changing so quickly that it's very hard to keep up with in this industry. But I think it'll be fine.
My next question for you is, you've seen value in, opening up new connections and kind of building new community and partnerships. You've seen value in podcasting, in getting a sponsor to kind of be involved with you on an ongoing basis, even help cover the production costs. What are some of the other key areas you feel like in your business that you, even if anecdotal, you feel like this podcast has helped move the needle for your business in some way?
Well, I know that people are listening because I talk to them at conferences, or they'll email me. I wish more people would. I would love to hear from them. But I have definitely received, client inquiries. And I know a few people that signed up for my most recent course had heard me from a podcast. I've definitely made more connections on LinkedIn, which is where I do a lot of my marketing and even selling. And it's built my email list, which is a huge marketing asset for me. So I can actually trace 2 clients that I have worked with that said they found me from my podcast, but I also just that credibility piece. So I know we were talking about Seth Godin, how Seth Godin was on my podcast, which was mind blowing and amazing. And I still can't even believe that happened, to be honest. But that was because his team at Goodbid, so he's running a new nonprofit auction company. They reached out to me on LinkedIn and they said, "Oh, we've been seeing you've been posting. We heard your podcast with the Microsoft philanthropies person. We would like to be on your podcast." And I said, "Oh, that's great." Not thinking ever that Seth would be. And then they came back and said, "Seth took a look at your stuff and listened to a few episodes. He really wants to be the guest." And just to have that credibility, that sort of confidence was, really incredible. That was the highlight, obviously, of this year for me. And he was so gracious and so kind and just so wonderful to work with. But having that level of visibility, like it's really, you can't pay for it. It's really hard to pay for that kind of professional credibility.
Well, you get it because you've been showing up for years doing it consistently and like giving your audience good content, valuable, authentic content. And so I think the space that a lot of times, we sit in as, a content creator or a business owner is one where, there's always this kind of like, what's the value I can bring to my audience? But then what's the ROI on like spending all my time on this content? And I think you are such a good case study or example. I don't want to refer to you as a case study, but such a good example of like, it worked.
Well, it's all about showing up consistently. That is something that when I first started my business, I listened to, it was probably Amy Porterfield or maybe Marie Forleo. And I was listening to like online marketers because I thought that was a business I really wanted to have. And I'm still trying to grow that piece of my business. But the takeaway was constantly show up. Just show up, give away everything for free. And then your one-on-one consulting, your in-depth courses, that's what you charge for. Your speaking engagements eventually. I spoke for free for years. My gosh, I spoke at Chambers of Commerce and Kiwanis and Junior League and anyone and everybody that would have me. And then I blogged for 10 years weekly because it was something I just thought, okay, I've got to do this. It's the only way that I can establish credibility and build trust and affinity with an audience that's really hard to break into. And what I think is people jump around, like they're like, oh, I'm going to blog for a year, or I'm going to podcast for a year, and then I'm going to do webinars for a year. But I would recommend always like picking something and being consistent. So my blog now, I really don't write it every week. There's no way I could do this in the podcast, but my podcast is my content that I can repurpose and actually put on the blog and show up. It's sort of how I'm showing up. And I talked actually to Seth about this because he stopped his podcast and he said, you know what? I did it for 2 years. I really loved it. He said, but now I'm just finding another way to show up. I'm just doing things in a different way. But he said, I wouldn't have done it for 6 months. I really wanted to do it for a long period of time to see the results because, oh my gosh, like anything else, it's like pushing a boulder up a hill sometimes. Like it's a marathon, not a sprint.
What I remember sometimes, like earlier on in my career, before I'd gone out on my own and was trying to, as a leader of marketing teams, say, this is why I think we should do podcasting, or this is why I think we should spend our time on LinkedIn content. Yeah. Where are the leads? I think a lot of people are so caught up on like marketing and sales attribution that they're often missing the bigger picture of show up and like do good things for people, share free content. I'm with you on that. Make things free. And like people who really want to buy from you will come to you, as opposed to you chasing people who maybe don't care about buying anything at all at the moment.
Absolutely. And the thing with podcasting, actually, Jenny Blake told me this and it made so much sense, is it's your voice in someone's ear. You can't buy that kind of trust. And if someone doesn't like me, that's fine. They know they don't like me. I mean, that's cool. If they listen to my podcast, they're like, oh man, I hate her voice. Totally fine. Then we probably wouldn't be great working together. But if someone says, oh, I've heard of Julia, I want to kind of check her out. I want to see what she's all about. And then they get a good feeling from me. It's such a personal medium. It's so much more personal than writing a blog, and this is why I really want to try to do more video, because that's even the next level personal that from audio. But audio is sort of my comfort zone right now. But it is that you like think of the podcast that you listen to, or news, or the radio, or WBUR, whatever it is, that those voices are so familiar. Like if you heard them in the grocery store, you would know, and you just really have a feeling that you get when you hear them. So that's what I'm really trying to do with my show.
By the way, I want to first off just say, I actually think, as I was going back down memory lane and trying to think about how long we've been doing it, I actually think you maybe were my first client.
Amazing. And I hope I've brought a lot of people to you.
Okay. So give me one last kind of final thing that you feel like you want to tell this audience right now, either about podcasting or maybe something exciting that you're working on, a project that you want to shout out about.
Oh, I don't know about a project. What I want to tell this audience is that I just read a statistic this morning that said 90% of the content online next year will be generated by AI. And that really horrified me. I don't have any issues with generative AI. I think they're fantastic tools. But the only way that we're going to stand out and cut through the clutter is by being unique and by having our own voice and by doing things that the AI can't do. And I think podcasting, sure, maybe you could have an AI podcast. I'm sure that can happen. But having your unique stamp on things and having your unique voice come through and not being afraid of doing something a little bit different, I think that would probably be my best piece of marketing advice for businesses, for nonprofits, for brands, for anybody.
Well, hey, thanks so much for being on Talking Shizzle today. It was awesome having you. Thanks for joining us, everyone. I hope this was helpful. It's good to be back behind the mic, and we'll see you next time. Well, hey there. That was fun. I love how much mind-blowing and mind-opening shizzle our guests bring to us with every single episode. We hope you enjoyed the conversation as much as we did. Make sure to hit that subscribe button on your favorite podcast player so that you don't miss a beat of the Talking Shizzle podcast. And if you're listening on Apple, be sure to let us know what you thought and leave us a review. We'd love to hear from our listeners so that we can bring you all the good, juicy business growth shizzle that you'd like to hear about. Be sure to get in touch with us and follow along at creativeshizzle.com or shoot us an email at podcast@creativeshizzle.com. Now, until next time, we hope you go get your big shizzle done.